Very much. Gail is quite knowledgeable in the area of Monocacy because she's a battlefield tour guide down there. And several years ago, I was down there with a group and she was gracious enough to take us through all kinds of cornfields and mud fields and all kinds of stuff like that. Way beyond what was out there. And I'm sure you go out there, she'd do the same thing for you. Gail also has her new book with her tonight. And after the meeting, she will be more than happy to sell you a copy and autograph a copy. But Gail, I'll bring Frank up here if he did introduce you. Frank?
Well, my job's mostly done because the judge said most of what I was going to say. Gail did get a bachelor's degree from George Washington University in D.C. She did some graduate work at Harvard and Johns Hopkins. She's was a Fed for 20 plus years at the Department of Defense. And then she retired to become a Civil War enthusiast and has been doing some writings like that. Her book won an award, William Seward, for the best biography of 2011. So with what Judd said and what I said, I think you should be intrigued by Gail. And Gail.
I have one other memory of my first time here. Most of the women here will appreciate this. I came with heels on, and my heels had leather soles. And they had just polished this floor, and it was the longest walk from my chair to this podium that I had taken in a long time because I was sure I was going to slip and fall flat out. So it's great to be back here in this absolutely beautiful room. Last time I talked about Lew Wallace. He's the subject of my new book, The Shadow of Shiloh. But tonight, I'm going to talk about the campaign in which Wallace played such an important part. The Confederate invasion of Maryland in 1864. It's a fairly unknown campaign. Most people think the Confederates didn't come north after 1863, after Gettysburg. But they did indeed come north in 1864. And it was Robert E. Lee's decision to create this army and send it north. Lee took full advantage, or took Napoleon's maxim that the only true wisdom in a general is determined courage to heart, and made one of the most courageous decisions of his career. He released the Second Corps of his army. A little over a quarter of his army in June of 1864, when he faced an army of over 100,000 men, led by U.S. Grant, a man known, and whom Lee knew by now, had bulldog-like tenacity. This is in June 1864, after the carnage of the Overland campaign. I was listening to a history program a couple of months ago, and they commented that after Cold Harbor, Grant was on an inexorable march to victory. Well, I hope tonight to show you all that there was nothing inexorable about victory for the Union forces in the summer of 1864. The stakes were very high for the Union in 1864, higher than in 62 and 63. Why? It was a presidential election year. Abraham Lincoln was running for president. The Democrats had made it clear that they were going to run on a platform of peace with the South, and indeed they would nominate George Britton McClellan for president on a peace platform. Lee understood how important this year was for the North. And he understood that his best chance for winning at this point lay in something that would bring the North to the peace table, something that would shatter Northern morale. In June of 1863, his great victory at Chancellorsville, he wrote Jefferson Davis, "We should neglect no honorable means of dividing and weakening our enemies. And we should give all the encouragement we can to the rising peace party in the North." Now, 1864 had started out as a year of great hope for the Union. U.S. Grant, the man who had taken Vicksburg, the man who had saved Chattanooga for the Union, had come east, taken command of all the Union armies, but was with the Army of the Potomac. The northern morale was high. The northern people expected that now, essentially, with Grant in charge, it would be a cakewalk to Richmond, and the war would be over. Reality, as you all know, proved far different. There were 53,000 Union casualties in the Overland Campaign, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor. By the time Cold Harbor was finished in early June 1864, Northern morale had plummeted. The price of gold had reached an all-time high, and this will sound familiar. Abraham Lincoln and Congress were bickering over Reconstruction, a Reconstruction that most Northerners thought would never come. Lee had problems too. He was outmanned, he was outgunned, and he had a problem in the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley could not fall. The Shenandoah Valley was the source of much of the food for Lee's army. Southwestern Virginia was the source of enormous amounts of lead and salt for Lee's army. The railroads were critical. The railroad that ran through Lynchburg, the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad, connected the East and the West. Lincoln had called it the gut line of the Confederacy. And the railroad that ran from Stanton in the Central Valley brought foodstuffs south to Lynchburg. Lynchburg was crucial for the Confederacy. Lynchburg was a hospital center, it was a major manufacturing center, and it was the supply depot for all those supplies from the Shenandoah Valley. Now, as part of Grant's grand plan, he had created an army of 18,000 to seize the Shenandoah Valley. In June of 1864, that army was led by this man, Major General David Hunter. Hunter's army was on the outskirts, or moving to the outskirts of Lynchburg. Jefferson Davis contacted Lee and said, "Lynchburg cannot fall. You must help save the city." The Valley forces were simply too few to hold back an army of 18,000 men. Braxton Bragg, the infamous Braxton Bragg, at this point was Jefferson Davis's military advisor. Bragg added a note to Lee, to Jefferson Davis's letter, and he said, "If we can remove the threat from Hunter, Washington might be open to our forces." Washington, D.C. Well, Lee thought about it. He did not want to release any forces. But he thought about it overnight, and he changed his mind. Clearly, what he decided was that there were two possibilities here. First, if he sent an army north to threaten the North again, Grant would be forced to divert some of his forces from the Army of the Potomac. That might give Lee a chance to go on the offensive again. This, in essence, Lee wanted to seize the initiative. Now, the other thing Lee thought, if I send this army north to threaten, and if possible take Washington, D.C., I can change the whole face of the war. Maybe Abraham Lincoln will not be reelected Assuredly, if my force seizes Washington, D.C., U.S. Grant will be in deep trouble. Now, how could Lee possibly, seriously contemplate the seizure of Washington, D.C.? 161 forts and batteries with over 800 guns. Well, Lee read the newspapers like everyone else, the northern newspapers, and he knew that in order to make up for Grant's losses in the overland campaign, the defenses of Washington, D.C. had been stripped. Henry Halleck, the Army Chief of Staff, the man responsible for Washington, had sent no less than 48,000 men from the defenses of Washington to Grant's army. Now, the heavy artillerists who died, such profusion at Cold Harbor, those were the men from the defenses of Washington. Those were the men who were trained to operate those guns. Well, who replaced them? A combination of Ohio 100 Days men, local militia, and veteran reserves. As of the end of June 1864, there were 10,000 men guarding Washington, D.C. So it was indeed vulnerable. Lee therefore saw opportunity knocking, and he decided on June 13th to release the 2nd Corps of his army, some 9,000 men. This was a storied corps. We're talking about the Stonewall Brigade here. We're talking about the Hayes and Stafford's Louisianans. He sent that corps, along with 24 guns, to Lynchburg. Now, who's going to command the whole? Who is he going to find at this point? With Longstreet wounded, Jackson dead, A.P. Hill ill. Well, he chose Jubal Early. Jubal Anderson Early, West Point graduate, a man who had fought in every campaign of the Army of Northern Virginia, rising from regimental command to, in June 1864, command of the 2nd Corps, the rank of Lieutenant General. Now, Early didn't look like a general. In the Seminole War, he developed arthritis. He had a pronounced stoop. He had a high, squeaky voice with a nasal twang, which is, he was from southwestern Virginia. And that's a characteristic of, at that point, of accidents down there. Okay. Possibly because of the pain from his rheumatism, I think, he had a very sarcastic wit, a biting sense of humor, and he was the most profane man in the Army of Northern Virginia, legendarily so. Lee, with a touch of humor, called him my bad old man. But after, in 1865, at the end of the war, Lee also wrote that Early exhibited during his whole service high intelligence, sagacity, bravery, and untiring devotion to the cause. Now, this would simply bond Jubal Early to Robert E. Lee. And as you all know, Jubal Early is one of the primary proponents of the lost cause after the Civil War. Well, what was Early like as a general? Well, he was brave to a fault. He was decisive, and he tended to like to go on the offense. He was a lot, in those senses, like Robert E. Lee. He and one of his subordinates, General John B. Gordon, didn't always get along, but Gordon said that he was one of the coolest and most imperturbable of men under fire and in extremity. Another one of his subordinates said he had what he described as a self-reliant, self-directing strength, the kind of thing that you need to be in independent command. His men, well, I wouldn't say they liked him, they admired him. They called him Old Jew. Some of them called him, behind his back, Old Lop Ears. And one of the most wonderful backhanded compliments I've ever read One of his soldiers said Early was as brave as he is homely, and as homely a man as any man you ever saw. Now, Early, but on the minus side, Early had a difficult relationship with some of his subordinates. He did not trust the Valley cavalry, and they would make up the majority of his cavalry in this campaign. And he demanded, as he demanded much of himself, he demanded much of his men. Perhaps, at times, too much. And push it again. Lee released Early on June 13th, and Early moved to Lynchburg, which was, he began arriving in Lynchburg on the 17th of June, just about the time that David Hunter arrived with his army, began arriving in Lynchburg. One of Hunter's staff wrote, "We can laugh at anything less than one of Lee's Army Corps to reinforce the Valley troops." I don't know, very prophetic words. Well, there was skirmishing on the 17th of June, skirmishing on the 18th of June. And Hunter took some prisoners on the 18th of June. He found out that indeed he was facing one corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. And Hunter quite simply lost his nerve. He was a long way from his base of operations, which is Martinsburg, up at the northern end of the valley in West Virginia. He was also low on ammunition. So one can't exactly fault him for retreating, but it was the way he retreated. Instead of retreating down the valley to protect his command area, he retreated into the mountains of West Virginia. His plan was to float down the Kanawha River, steam up the Ohio, catch the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad at Parkersburg, West Virginia, and move swiftly back to the northern end of the valley. The problem was it was a drought year. His men ended up walking to the Ohio River. They then had, at some points, to drag steamboats over the shoals in the Ohio River. In short, Hunter would not be back until after Jubal Early had recrossed the Potomac River. So he and his army were out of the action. Now, Hunter did something else. He did not tell the authorities in Washington that he was going to be late until they were almost in the hands of Jubal Early. On the 23rd of June, as Early observed Hunter and moved into West Virginia, and he wasn't going to follow him, he began a swift movement down the valley. His objective was to move and get into Maryland, get to Washington before anyone really understood it. He stopped for a half a day on the 28th of June at Stanton. What he did there was he cut out everything and every man and every animal, every piece of equipment that could not move and move swiftly. But he did something else important. He sent a telegram to Robert E. Lee. He said, "I will proceed according to your instructions to threaten Washington, and if I find an opportunity to take it." I emphasize this because after the war, Early always maintained he never intended to take Washington, when in fact he himself said he did. Okay, Early's army had added the Valley troops, or Early had added the Valley troops to his army. He had an army of 16,000, 12,000 infantry, about 3,500 cavalry, artillerists to man 36 guns. So this was no small force, no small raiding force. He also had some of the best generals in the Army of Northern Virginia. John Brown Gordon, Stephen Dodson Ramseur, Robert Emmett Rhodes were his division commanders. His second in command was Major General John Breckinridge, former Vice President of the United States, hard-fighting Kentuckian who had come from the Western Theater to command in the Shenandoah Valley. By the 4th of July, Jubal Early had driven all the troops Union troops out of Martinsburg and Harper's Ferry up onto Maryland Heights. By the 5th of July, he was crossing the Potomac River. By the 8th of July, he was moving on Frederick, Maryland. Why Frederick? Because out of Frederick runs the Georgetown Turnpike, one of the best roads into Washington. The Union command response until the 5th of July was negligible. Henry Halleck, who was in command in the North, simply did not believe there was a serious threat out there. Halleck believed it was cavalry raid. Halleck believed Hunter would be back in time. Now, on the 5th of July, Grant got word from deserters. Grant's now besieging Petersburg, so his headquarters is at City Point. He got word from deserters that the 2nd Corps was in Maryland. He sent a telegram to Halleck, and he said, "I'll send a corps north." Halleck said, "No, I don't need it. Hunter's coming. Send me your dismounted cavalry." Grant decided to send something else. He sent the 3rd Division of the 6th Corps, put them on steamships to go to Baltimore. From Baltimore, they were going to get on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and go out and reinforce Harper's Ferry. This tells you something about the state of Union intelligence at this point. Harper's Ferry was in Jubal Early's hands at this point, but the commander of all the Union armies did not know that. One man was going to stand in Jubal Early's way. Major General Lew Wallace, commander of the Middle Department of Delaware and Maryland west to the Monocacy River. Wallace believed the reports. He believed that there probably was a Confederate force moving north. He knew that if any troops were going to move to the west, they were going to need the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad to move swiftly. And he knew, therefore, that the great Iron Railroad Bridge across the Monocacy River must be protected. So Wallace began gathering all the troops he had. Now, his department had been stripped like Washington. He was able to muster 3,200 troops, mostly militia and Ohio 100 daysmen, and one 6-gun battery. But Wallace was going to go out and defend that bridge only as long as he could. At this point, he had no intention of staying if confronted by a large Confederate force. But on July 6th, Wallace found out a division of veterans was on the way to Baltimore, and that they were to go to Harper's Ferry. And Wallace at this point is out at Monocacy Junction himself. And this is when Wallace decided to fight. Why? Because he knew the condition of Washington. He suspected that a movement on Washington would be made by this Confederate force, although he wasn't sure. He had no idea of the size of the force, or even the composition of the force. But he was going to take those veterans. He said, if it's cavalry, I can stop this in its tracks. So Wallace decided to make a stand at Monocacy Junction. Now what you see on that map is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad moving across the Monocacy River. You can see the railroad bridge that Wallace went to defend. And you can see, I wish I had a pointer here, you can see the Georgetown Turnpike moving to Washington. Wallace knew that he had a good chance for defense, if nothing else, at Monocacy Junction. Why? Because he was going to place his troops on the south and east side of the river, with a river in their front. On the south and east side of the river, there are bluffs. So Wallace would be looking out over the plain over which the Confederates had to approach him. He knew it would take time for the Confederates to find a ford to get across the river. Now, I want to remind you, Lew Wallace is going to have 6,500 men and one 6-gun battery. Jubal Early at this point will have his full infantry force of 12,000, about 1,100 cavalry, because a lot of his cavalry was back in the valley, and 36 guns. There was no chance that Wallace was going to defeat this man. He hoped he could hold him. Wallace performed his first great service on the night of July 8th. He had gone to Monocacy. He was at, his full force was at Monocacy Junction. Confederates had come through Frederick. Early's army was moving through Frederick, had turned on the Georgetown Turnpike. So he sent a telegram to Halleck. He said, there is a Confederate army with infantry, cavalry, and artillery in proportion moving on the road to Washington. I will put myself in a position to defend. Well, Henry Halleck woke up because this is 30 miles from Washington. Within an hour, Halleck sent a telegram to Grant saying considerable reinforcements must be sent here. If you can't send reinforcements, it is doubtful if I can hold the city of Washington. Well, Wallace performed his second great service on July 9th, when he managed to hold Jubal Early for an entire day. Early's force finally found a ford across the river. There was considerable fighting. The men in the 3rd Division of the 6th Corps wrote about this battle over and over again. They fought hard. There were a lot of casualties. It was a long, tough day for them. But at the end of the day, Wallace was forced to retreat. He was literally pushed off the road to Washington. And the next morning, July 10th, Jubal Early and his men were on the road again. There was consternation in the North. This is the headline from a Philadelphia newspaper. People were terrified, worried in the North, terrified in Washington. Frank Wilkinson, a prominent Washingtonian who would fight in the D.C. militia, wrote that Washington was in an uproar. We heard that Wallace's army had been annihilated. Still later, that the government's books, records, and money were being packed in boxes preparatory to its flight to New York. Indeed, there was a steamer at the Washington Navy Yard that Gideon Welles kept the steam up in to evacuate Lincoln and his cabinet. Lincoln telegraphed Grant and said, I need you in Washington. Grant replied, I am sending a fine general and a fine corps. He started them out in steamboats on the 10th of July, and if I come, it will have a bad effect, whatever that means. Okay. By noon on July 11th, Jubal Early was in front of the northernmost fort in the Washington chain of forts, Fort Stevens. If he had arrived early in the morning, he would have found 209 men confronting him, all Ohio 100 days men. But they could see the dust cloud of the Confederates, and so Washington reinforcements were rushed to the Fort Stevens area, including Montgomery Meade's quartermaster clerks, a story I'm sure all of you have heard. The dismounted cavalry that Grant had sent north was sent out to Fort Stevens to join the Ohio 100 Days men, to join the militia. So when Early arrived, there was quite a force at Fort Stevens. There was, however, no one who could fire the guns. One of Early's men quoted, we thought they were firing the guns at the moon and stars that day. Now, Early had a problem himself. His men were tired, very tired. Early and his generals rode along the line trying to get them to move faster. These guys had walked from Lynchburg, Virginia, in temperatures over 90 degrees, in dust. They had fought a battle, and they were tired. So Early's army was straggling badly. So when Early arrived at the fort at noon, only Rhodes' division was with him. But he immediately deployed Rhodes' men, and they moved on the fort, and they got within 50 yards of the fort, when out came the dismounted cavalry, and those men, those Ohio 100 Days men, and by golly, they put up one tough fight, and Rhodes' veterans retreated. The 6th Corps, the rest of the 6th Corps, which is what Brennan sent, was still on the Potomac River. Now they began arriving that afternoon, late that afternoon. Jubal Early's army was up by late that afternoon. Early and his generals met that night and decided to attack the next day. But the 6th Corps, it was too late, the 6th Corps had arrived. When Early got up to do a morning reconnaissance, he found the parapets lined with veterans. There was fighting that day. This is the day when famously Abraham Lincoln was fired upon, and someone yelled, "We don't believe it's Oliver Wendell Holmes, but who knows? Get down, you fool." That night, Early retreated. He told one of his generals, "Well, we may not have taken Washington, but we sure scared Abe Lincoln like hell." It had been a very close thing. But for the pickup force at Monocacy on July 9th and Fort Stevens on July 11th, there might have been Confederates in Washington burning, stealing, and generally making mischief, and creating a really terrible situation for Abraham Lincoln. However, there were repercussions. People in the North were furious. 53,000 casualties. 4 years of war. 3.5 years of war. And what had happened? Was Lee trapped around Richmond? Well, not quite. He had come very near to seizing Washington. The Assistant Secretary of War wrote Grant that the public in Congress would hold him responsible for this whole disgraceful affair, adding that the black and revolting dishonor of the siege of Washington would very likely lead to the defeat of Mr. Lincoln and the election of General McClellan to the presidency. Newspapers echoed this judgment. One New York newspaper editorialized, "If the president cannot discover and correct the sources of these blunders, the people in the approaching election will not be slow to discover one method by which they can put an end to this reign of military incompetence in Washington." And as you all know, July and August were Lincoln's low point. Well, Early went back to the Valley. Now, Grant thought he was going to head back to Richmond immediately, so he pulled back the 6th Corps. Hunter had, of course, arrived, and Hunter had his full army up now. Early had no intention of going back to Richmond. Early was there to divert resources from U.S. Grant. So he went on the offensive. And at the Battle of Second Kernstown on July 24th, he literally routed Hunter out of the valley. Hunter's entire force recrossed the Potomac River very fast, and Jubal Early was in control in the valley. No, sorry, got that. Well, while Hunter had been briefly in control in the valley, he had burned the houses of several prominent secessionists. This upset Jubal Early, and he decided, as he wrote, it was time to teach the Northern public a lesson. So he decided to send John McCausland with a force of cavalry to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, to demand a ransom of $100,000 in gold or $500,000 in U.S. currency. If it was not provided then they were to burn the town. This is not John McCausland. This was Jubal Early. He took responsibility for it. The good citizens of Chambersburg believed Union cavalry would arrive to save them, so they refused to pay the ransom, and so John McCausland did what he was supposed to, what he was told, what he was ordered to do. He burned Chambersburg to the tune of $6 million that the state of Pennsylvania eventually paid the citizens of Chambersburg. Grant realized he had to do something. This could not continue. So, he sent the 6th Corps back to create an army of 35,000 infantry. He sent 2 cavalry divisions from the Army of the Potomac to create a cavalry of 8,000. And he gave command of the whole to one of his favorite commanders, Phil Sheridan. He gave command to Phil Sheridan at this house, the Thomas House, which is on Monocacy battlefield. And there he told Sheridan, follow him to the death. Now Sheridan had kind of conflicting orders here, because he had been in Washington on his way to the Thomas farm. He had talked to the Secretary of War, and the Secretary of War said there must be no more defeats in the vicinity of Washington. The public will not stand for it, and the election will probably not go our way. So Sheridan was very cautious initially, but finally, 3rd Winchester, Fisher's Hill, and Cedar Creek, he defeated Jubal Early soundly and finally, and he took control of the valley. Now, he outnumbered Jubal Early 3-1. So this was a time when Grant believed, I'm going to decimate this force. Gave the force the people that it needed, the manpower, and it was done. But Jubal Early had accomplished something. He had held the valley. The summer harvest went to Lee's army. Supplies continued to flow from southwestern Virginia. The other thing Jubal Early had done was exactly what Lee wanted him to do. He had diverted forces from Grant's army so that Grant was unable to mount the major offensive he wanted to mount that fall. Lee, however, was unable to take advantage of the situation because Lee lacked the resources. I think Jubal Early did as much as he could have possibly done with the force he had. But kudos to 2 scratch forces, Lew Wallace's army at Monocacy and the men at Fort Stevens, for keeping Jubal Early from achieving his final goal. Thank you very much. I'll be very happy to answer questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is great.
As I mentioned before, Gail will have her books here after the meeting for purchase and for signatures. I will also remind you that next month we're not meeting here. We're meeting at the country club up on, I think, Brownwood Road, isn't it? Good Hope Road, pardon me, Good Hope Road. 60th and Good Hope Road. With that, we'll conclude our November meeting of the Milwaukee Civil Roundtable. I look forward to seeing all of you next month, and have a great Thanksgiving. Thank you so very much.
Now it seems then, and true today as well, that as soon as a soldier is enlisted, they want to begin to come home. Patrick Gilmore's inspiring When Johnny Comes Marching Home spoke to the troops during the Civil War and remains an American classic.
I commend to you this afternoon this group of volunteers, my friends, ladies and gentlemen, the 1st Brigade Band. Join us as we play our final signature number. This is a number that's somewhat ironic. This is a number that General Sherman soon grew to hate. And the reason he hated it was wherever he would appear, they would play it. He would show up here and they would play it, and he would show up there and they would play it. He showed his face anywhere and you would hear our signature tune, the tune you heard us down the street this morning with, Marching Through Georgia.